So in the last 5 years, I'd have the opportunity to talk to a lot of organizations who have abandoned test automation projects for one reason or another. But the main reason that they state is that they're not getting value from the test automation. And one of the biggest aspects that we've identified that stops value from coming through is not necessarily test automation itself. It's definition of a key process involved with time to feedback to the developer that's stopping that value coming through. So today's video, we want to talk about optimizing this one process that'll make or break your test automation initiative. With that, let's get started. Okay, so let's agree on the goal of test automation first and foremost. At Loop, what we talk about is the goal for test automation is to optimize the time to feedback for a developer to know whether or not their new code needs to fix bugs that it's introduced or passes, right? And there is actually kind of purist ways of looking at this. This is generally TDD or BDD, where the test automation is defined actually before the developer ever writes a line of code. So they have that scorecard already set. They write code, they run the tests, and that's what you hear about when you think about Facebook pushing 1,000 times a day or some of these other things where a developer can know, okay, my code passes. The reality, though, is that most organizations don't do this. Most organizations are not going to do processes like TDD or BDD. And so they need a system using test automation because it can provide a much faster feedback loop. But there's one key friction point that oftentimes fails to get defined. So let's talk through an example, right? So a developer basically is writing a new feature, right? And let's call it, they're updating the ability to add a user. So in this case, the developer is updating a workflow to add a user, and they're adding the fact that we now require a phone number in order to add a user, right? They want to have this workflow. So there's a bunch of automation, right? And what's the goal of that automation? Well, let's say there's 500 existing tests. Some of those are covering that feature, a user. Other of those are testing a bunch of other things, right? And we basically want to run that automation as part of the developer pushing their feature to test, right? So the developer can know, okay, did the automation break anything in the app? What's really interesting, and what I find a ton of organizations don't necessarily realize, is that the automation actually has a really big dependency, which is the code base. And the code base changing a key workflow will break an aspect of the automation that depends on it, right? And so, yes, the automation might catch one or two bugs that were introduced not related to the ability to add a new user, but the automation is going to fail in all of the test cases around add a new user because there's a new required field, right? And this is what we call at Loop the value gap. And what we mean by that is this is the time in which the test automation is not able to provide legitimate feedback to the developer. And what we try to do is optimize for minimizing the value gap. We try to optimize for making sure that the test automation gets back into a state to be able to provide that feedback to the developer as fast as possible. And so we really try to define this process with every organization that we work at, right, to optimize it, right? So the developer pushes their automation to a test environment. The automation runs. In most organizations, what that means is that the automation engineer needs to be the first person to look at those results. Oftentimes, a developer can sometimes also look at those results, but let's say there's 500 tests and there's 30 failures. 28 out of those 30 failures are oftentimes related to this one update of the workflow that they've done. So maybe there are two legitimate bugs, but most organizations don't have their developers look through all 30 failures just to find the two bugs. So an automation engineer, they grab the results. They say, what do we need to do? Well, we need to update these 28 tests to be able to make sure that they now are working with the expected new feature. And we need to report the two bugs to the developer. So they report the two bugs. The developer can get started working on those two bugs. And then they update the workflow for add user. They add the required field. They then push that back into the CI/CD process. And when that runs again, now the automation no longer has the value gap. All of the test cases are up to date. They know what to expect. And you'll get all passes. The developer then fixes the two bugs. They push. And because they're using the branch that has the refactored test automation, they will get all greens. And at that point, you can move on and you can move to production, right? Now, there are aspects of this that you might say, well, wait a second, can we somehow speed this up? Absolutely, but it involves more continued process, basically improvement. You could put the automation engineer on some of the tickets. If the developer knows exactly what the field IDs and some of these other things that they're going to be doing for that new add a phone number field, the automation engineer can refactor that. But most organizations go the opposite way. Most organizations don't recognize that the automation in itself is a dependency on the code base. So what they do is they treat the automation as a completely separate product to be run at the very end of the sprint. They have a bunch of developers pushing a bunch of changes into this environment, breaking the automation in a bunch of ways. And then they run the automation at the end of the sprint thinking, okay, let's run our 1,000 test regression suite or our 500 test regression suite. And a ton of it breaks for legitimate reasons, which is that the developers have changed the expected state under test. And you have this massive value gap where now in the 2 days or 1 day that automation was supposed to run at the end of the sprint, then basically you're not able to get value from this thing that you've invested in. And so when we talk about this with clients, all we talk about is minimizing the amount of changes the developer is making to a push and making sure that the automation engineers are really integrated into those changes and trying to optimize the time to feedback for every developer individually, optimizing the time that they know, okay, I broke something, I need to fix it. So with that, I hope this helps. I hope that you can look at your automation process and realize, wait a second, this is why we're not getting value from test automation. And with that, happy testing. Talk soon.